Hi, and welcome to Chatterbox, the podcast where we talk about everything code switching and why it's totally normal. Today, we're taking a closer look at a popular myth. Is code mixing really just lazy, or is there more to it? Let's see what the science has to say.
Hey guys, and welcome to episode on switching back and forth between languages, or what some researchers call code mixing or code switching. And today we're going to discuss the popular myth that code mixing is actually lazy. But we want to paint a different picture, namely one told by research that code mixing is complex, it's intentional, and is often cognitively very demanding. To understand this myth, maybe we have to first break down what it actually is. Before we jump right into the topic though, we want to kind of pay homage to the fact that we're going to take a very privileged position in this episode. And there are actually some groups like people of color or people from minority that speak minority languages that don't feel like they have a choice to code switch, but rather they need to code switch to support their family, to be able to come across as a professional in work environments, for instance. So if you're interested in this and in this complex dynamic, then we've actually linked in the info box interesting TED Talks and articles where people of color and people from minority languages are given a voice to talk about what code mixing actually means to them. And we'd really appreciate it if you check this out. Without further ado, we are today going to focus on, is code mixing lazy? First of all, what actually is it? And researchers kind of differ on what they take code mixing to mean. There is, however, more consensus on the fact what code means. So code often refers to a language, but can also be used to refer to a dialect or sometimes even a register. So for example, informal versus formal speech. So when you speak at work versus when you use slang to talk to your friends. And when we talk about language or code today, then we want to encompass all that. So dialects, registers, vernaculars. But for ease of speaking, we're going to be using language as a sole term. And the switching aspect is more highly debated, however. Some scholars prefer the term code mixing over switching because they kind of feel like switching implies that you can totally switch one language off and the other on, and vice versa. Others argue that mixing more so captures the fact that we can switch languages within one sentence versus switching, which captures the fact that between sentences we could switch. So we say one sentence in one language and then another sentence in another language. And then there are some scholars that argue that some languages or a language and a dialect, they actually might share expressions. And so we can't really say when someone switches, and therefore they prefer the term code meshing. As this is not our main focus, we will stick to the term code mixing and switching, and we'll take it as an umbrella term to refer to all of these different nuances and definitions. So if we talk about what we take code switching to mean, I want to point you to some definitions we actually found. And we fed all these definitions into the word cloud. And some prominent ones are the alternation between languages. Might that be in conversation, in a sentence, or even in a paragraph. Others highlight that code switching is about a dialogue that spans cultures, a website that kind of informs us about what it means to grow up bilingual and to code switch when you're bilingual, says that code switching is actually peppering your speech, which we thought was a really cute and cool definition. Others say that code switching is alternation between languages. It might even be borrowing material from one language and then taking it and using it in another language. It might be observable problem-solving behavior. And others say it's a sophisticated maneuver that allows us to maintain fluency. In the following, we're going to see how all these definitions and the implication of these definitions might speak to the question of whether code switching is actually lazy.
Now the central question is, where does the idea that code mixing equals laziness come from? And in Germany, the evaluation of language depends on the social prestige of the speakers. So it's not really about how well you master your language. It's more about what is associated with. For example, English is more associated with education and modernity, while other languages are more associated with, for example, socioeconomically disadvantaged groups. And basically, it is pretended that Germany is a monolingual country, even though this doesn't correspond to reality and never has, if we look into the history, because medieval Europe was characterized by multilingualism. In the cities, the use of different languages was part of everyday life. And not only did different dialects meet, but also people used other languages that they had acquired through immigration or travel. So, for example, Latin was the language of education and religion. Hebrew and Aramaic were the written languages. And those who could use several languages in everyday life also used these skills creatively for linguistic mixing. So this was especially true for educated people. They mixed Latin and German, for example. And such language mixing didn't trigger any sort of panic or whatsoever. It was more like a natural part of educated speakers, especially also in later eras as well. And basically, societal multilingualism was already a norm in the past. So where did it change? It started to change in the 18th and 19th century in connection with the formation of nation states. So basically the idea of one nation of one language led to the suppression of dialects and multilingualism. There's also stigmatization through stereotypes. Code switching is, for example, devalued due to stigmatization associated with certain languages and varieties. If we look at, for example, which was already mentioned earlier, the African American vernacular. Code switching basically serves there to avoid negative stereotypes and to be seen, for example, as a leader or that you get a promotion. So especially in the workplace, so code switching is used by minorities to increase the perception of professionalism and hiring opportunities. And, for example, people said, and quote, "At this point in my career, code switching feels natural. I'm not even cognizant that I do it anymore." Or another quote is, "I go out of my way to make sure I don't appear lazy because I know the stereotypes." And Green and Walker looked in their paper into how monolingual norms influence the perception of code switching. And among other things, the paper defined that code switching is done to fit into a society in which people who speak the African American vernacular English are a, quote, racial minority. What is quite devastating is that many bilinguals themselves hold negative views about their code mixing and code switching. Terms are used such as laziness or impurity, and Wies et al. Also mentioned that these multilinguals have internalized the monolingual habitus, so only one language is, could you say, the norm, and they have internalized this to such an extent that they view their own mixing behavior critically and belittle themselves. When in contrast, actually, it's magnificent that they have such language proficiency that is required for fluent code switching. And it's very, very sad that this isn't recognized. But code mixing and code switching do not occur arbitrarily. There are reasons for why we mix and when such mixes and switches occur.
So is code mixing lazy? We would argue absolutely not. To switch between languages, researchers argue we draw on control mechanisms, the same ones we use when we focus our attention, switch between tasks, or don't go after every impulse. And sometimes not mixing might even be less efficient. especially, for example, if you're missing a word in one language. That might be because you have a smaller vocabulary in one language than the other, or because you just more frequently use one word in one language and therefore it just springs to mind faster, it's more available. Sometimes we also feel like an emotion or a nuance is better captured in one of our language over the other. So why not use that language then to capture this nuance or emotion? So how does this specifically speak to the question of code switching and laziness? To answer this question, I think we have to consider theories of how code switching actually works. And in early research, there was this idea of we switch one language on and then we switch the other language off and vice versa. But as we've discussed or kind of mentioned, this is not actually what contemporary researchers think happens. Think of code switching less of flipping a light switch on and off and more like adjusting the balance of a stereo. Sometimes one language is louder and sometimes the other. And there's actually evidence for the fact that we can never completely turn one language off. In an experiment with Russian English speakers, for instance, Spivey and Miriam, they tracked participants' eye movements of a display of 4 images while they listened to one word. For example, they listened to the word marker in English. And then one of the pictures was actually a stamp, which in Russian, the word for stamp is marku. I totally butchered that now, but the important part is, as you might have noticed, they sound very similar. And interestingly, what they found is even though the experiment was in English, the instructions were in English, the experiment was held in the States, still Russian English speakers very quickly shifted their eyes to the image of the stamp before they then looked at the marker. And researchers took this to mean that we can never completely switch one language off, even though we might not need it at this moment, and it might not even be beneficial. Still, it kind of interferes, so it affects the way that the participants completed the task at this time, even though they didn't need it. And in light of this evidence, it seems ridiculous to say, oh, you're lazy, just try harder, turn your language off, when it seems like we actually can't. This is why contemporary theories of how code switching works focus on aspects of, for example, control or suppression of one language in contrast to the other, the one you're using at this moment. So as we said, the same mechanisms that allow us to switch between tasks might also allow us to switch between languages. If we engage in code mixing on a regular basis, it might then appear that we use these mechanisms a lot. We might get really good at them, and this is what some research indicates. However, the ball is still out on this, and there's also research that finds that this is not necessarily the case. Also, word of caution, some theories don't assume these specific control mechanisms. Again, there are loads of different theories, but because we don't want to go into this huge theoretical debate, we just pointed to this one theory. If you're interested in this, then feel free to look into the accompanying document and make a little bit of a deep dive into some background literature on this. So if we return to our questions about laziness, we have to ask, can it really be lazy if the result of code mixing is a perfectly good sentence? In fact, if we switch languages to make our conversation clearer, to be more specific, how could that be lazy? I like to think of it this way. Code switching often involves mental control mechanisms, as we said, in some theories, and the same ones possibly that we use to focus our attentions. Does that sound lazy? I think it sounds cognitively rather active. From a brain efficiency standpoint, sticking to one language might even mean fewer resources, but in real-life conversation, this might not always be most efficient, especially, for example, as we said, if you're missing a word and the other language can just jump in and provide this word for you. With this in mind, I think it's really appropriate that at the beginning when we talked definitions, that some say mixing languages is actually an observable problem-solving behavior. It's not lazy, but it seems resourceful. Even if our own switching feels random at times, it really isn't. So Poplack, for instance, a very seminal scholar that investigated code switching, finds that it actually follows grammatical rules. And it's not random at all. They argue it's systematic, it's structured, and it mirrors fluency and not the lack of it. If you go into the accommodating document, there's actually an example where a speaker mixes. I'm not going to read it out because I'm probably going to butcher the dialect, so I want you to read it for yourself. the important aspect is that the interference from English, so the little chunk of English that's inserted, is inserted right at the point where then or then occurs. So the German den and the English den, which sound really similar and actually have really similar function. So it's interesting that the speaker doesn't seem to switch at just random points, but that there might be some systematicity to it. And even children seem to be able to switch without producing very ungrammatical sentences. For instance, in the example from Galitek, Meilewald and Tracy, a 2-year-old child said, "Warte doch, vor ich bin fertig mit diesem Puzzle." And as you can see, the sentence is still perfectly grammatical. So to produce this, speakers have to actually integrate two grammatical systems. And we don't only abide by one set of rules, but now we abide by two sets of rules. And still the sentence that comes out is grammatical. And this does not at all seem lazy to me, at least. As all these projects run under this underarching topic of multilingualism in education, this obviously poses the question of, what about code switching in education?
Basically, the presence of code switching in the classroom is unavoidable, and teachers, in especially bilingual classrooms, encounter code switching in the students' discourse, both at the within a sentence and between sentences. And it's a necessity for teachers to regard code switching as a communicative strategy. But not all forms of code switching are regarded as, could you say, like acceptable. The code switching between sentences is generally accepted as the most effective. We've heard earlier that code switching has functions and has rules, and these can also be investigated in the classroom. And a study by Hussein et al. Did that, and they aimed to identify the main functions and roles of code switching by teachers and students. So they looked into both sides, and they did that in secondary schools in Jordan. And the results were, regarding students, they code switched to maintain rapid and interpersonal relationships, to keep the line of communication without interruption, and to avoid any sort of conflict or misunderstanding. Meanwhile, the teachers code switched for effective purposes, giving instructions and directions, repetition, translation, topic shift, and class management. What they found out new was that teachers also code switched because of, quote, inadequate command or mastery of the target language, so linguistic insecurity. But I don't want to end here on a negative aspect. There are also positive aspects of code switching in education. And one who deals with that is Kim, and she looked into bilingual education in Korea. And she postulates that bilingual education may lead to more effective and meaningful language learning. And the reason why bilinguals switch their utterance and mix their languages is to deliver better meaning related to the society they belong to. So code switching is not due to a lack of skills, but to deliver better meaning. And bilingual education therefore might be beneficial because children are allowed to speak more than one language in the classroom, which might take away some pressure they otherwise would feel if they or if only one language would be allowed, but they couldn't communicate what they, for example, feel and so on, because they don't know the language so well. And so basically she concludes that making students use only English in Korea doesn't necessarily make learners learn the language more effectively. There are also other studies regarding code switching in the teaching and learning process. For example, Jinishi found out that children adapt their language to their conversation partner, or Hemming concluded that the awareness of social implications of code switching develops with age. Code mixing can also be used as a teaching method, and Chilik investigated this Their code mixing was used as a technique to introduce new vocabulary, and they found out that the students could rely on their existing morphosyntactic knowledge, and that code mixing is basically successful for learning new vocabulary and also a very successful teaching method. Basically, multilingualism naturally occurs in the classroom, whether it be through interaction of linguistic resources and understanding texts, retrieving vocabulary and finding formulations. And these monolingual practices that were going on for a long time are more and more successfully broken up, and the mixing that was long rejected now takes more and more place in the classroom, and methods of multilingualism learning arrangement encourage students to use multiple linguistic approaches.
So, calling code mixing lazy, in our opinion, often comes from a place of misunderstanding and prejudice. It ignores everything that we've just discussed, the cognitive demands and the rich cultural expression that are involved in code mixing. So next time you yourself code mix, don't apologize, but recognize it for what it is, an elegant act of linguistic multitasking.
And this was it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed our little podcast and may have learned something new. Tune in next week where we discuss code switching and acquisition. See you till then.